My name is Elizabeth Sanders, and I'm 42. For 15 years, I had built a life with David that others might have envied, steady, secure, and painstakingly predictable. I was the rock, the constant in his ever-shifting world. He chased passions, hobbies, mentors, and self-discoveries, while I anchored the practical side. The bills, the mortgage, the insurance, the investments. My life was built on order, logic, and calculated outcomes, and for a long time he told me he loved that about me. That love, or at least what I thought it was, crumbled last Thursday in our living room, a space David had insisted on redecorating in calming neutrals the previous fall. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, they flitted nervously to the vase perched on the media console, an ornament worth more than my first car. "You're not fun anymore, Elizabeth," he said, his voice almost casual. "I want a trial separation." I didn't respond immediately. My mind, trained to observe patterns and calculate consequences, absorbed everything. The preamble, the phrasing, the carefully rehearsed cadence, these were all for his comfort, not mine. The anger, when it came, didn't erupt. It crystallized, sharpening every subtle betrayal I'd ignored. The late-night texts, the new expensive workout clothes, the sudden, intense reverence for that spiritual guru, Zara, who coincidentally became his tennis partner. A scatterplot of tiny anomalies snapped into a linear equation, and the answer was devastatingly obvious. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. The man who was my partner, my husband, the one who promised a shared life of quiet stability, was a stranger. And he had been for months, maybe years. "Done," I said. Just one word, cold and deliberate. A stone thrown into a still pond. It wasn't the reaction he expected. His brow furrowed. "Done? Just like that? You're not even going to fight for us?" "I'm agreeing to your terms," I said evenly. "This is what you want. You should be happy." He looked flustered, like an actor discovering that the scene had skipped to the final monologue. "Okay, well, I'm going to pack." He retreated upstairs. I listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing, of my life being dismantled piece by piece. For a moment, white-hot rage surged through me. I wanted to shatter the vase, throw everything against the wall. But then came another wave. Grief, deep and suffocating. I remembered the girl I married, the one who'd been thrilled to eat cheap pizza on the floor of our first apartment, oblivious to anything but our shared happiness. Where had she gone? I let myself feel it all for an hour. The anger, the grief, the betrayal. And then I let it pass, replaced by clarity. This wasn't a trial. This was an ambush, and I would not be its victim. I reached for my phone and dialed Victoria, a highly recommended family law attorney. By the next morning, I sat in her office explaining the situation. She listened, impassive but attentive, then offered precise, methodical advice. Not for revenge, but for protection. "The moment of separation is a critical legal marker," she said. "Your actions from here forward must be transparent and defensible." Guided by her counsel, I spent the rest of that day executing deliberate steps to separate our lives. I opened a personal checking account. I left a transitional buffer in the shared account to prevent immediate panic, but the remainder of the funds, all of my salary, were transferred to my secure account. I updated my direct deposit, deactivated shared credit cards, assumed responsibility for balances, and documented everything meticulously. It wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Every step was a consequence of his choice, a reflection of reality, not vengeance. By Saturday, David returned to collect some belongings. He acted breezy, like this was some grand adventure. "Hope you're not too lonely rattling around in this big house," he said with a pitying smile. "I'm managing," I replied. "By the way, I've started the formal process, just so you know." He glanced at his phone, distracted. "Process? What process?" "The separation, legal stuff, lawyers. You'll probably want to talk to one." He laughed, lightly, dismissively. "Oh, Elizabeth, so dramatic. It's just a trial. We'll talk in a few weeks." He had no idea. The rock he thought he left behind wasn't waiting passively. He had no concept of the storm he had triggered. Over the next few days, the first tremors began. A blocked card, a failed purchase, subtle panic, the tiny fractures of a life built on his assumptions. And as I watched it unfold, a quiet satisfaction ran beneath my grief. This was the first consequence of choosing your own path. It arrived slowly, methodically, and without apology. The war had begun, and I was ready. The week following David's departure felt like stepping into a quiet, calculated battlefield. I moved through my home with a sense of purpose, cataloging each step of the separation like pieces in a grand chess game. Every action was deliberate, every decision documented. I opened a new checking account, leaving just a transitional buffer in the old one to prevent immediate chaos. My salary would now flow into this secure account. I updated all direct deposits, deactivated shared credit cards, and assumed responsibility for balances. I noted the exact time and date of each transaction, a ledger of clarity in a world David had decided to shatter. I wasn't being cruel, I was enforcing consequences. Logic dictated the rules, and the rules dictated fairness. When David returned on Saturday to pick up a few things, his posture was casual, too casual. He smiled, attempting lightness. "Managing okay, Elizabeth?" "Okay." "Yes," I said, steady and unshaken. "By the way, you should know I've started the formal legal process." He laughed, brushing it off. "Process? Elizabeth, it's just a trial separation. No need to make it dramatic." I let the laughter hang in the air. Let him adjust to the reality that the predictable woman he left behind wasn't waiting idly. The calm after my measured words was heavier than any shouting match could have been. Within days, the first cracks appeared. The blocked card triggered confusion and panic. David sent frantic messages, questions loaded with disbelief. "You did what? How could you do that without telling me?" I responded with simple clarity. "This is the process. Everything follows naturally from your choice." The buffer I had left in the old account prevented immediate collapse, but he realized, with growing discomfort, that the river of cash he had relied on was now dammed. Each denial, each declined purchase, each reminder of his diminished control fed a quiet tension that grew daily. That Monday, I focused on insurance. Updating my employer portal to reflect my separation was simple, but the consequence was immediate. David's eligibility for my health, dental, and vision coverage would end at the month's close. I imagined his face, the subtle panic as he considered prescriptions, appointments, and all the small ways I had been silently sustaining him. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was inevitability. Every logical step I took reflected reality, not revenge. The world he wanted to enter, free, fun, unanchored, was a world that came with costs, and he would now experience them fully. I noticed the small, cinematic details during this process. The flutter of his eyes when he realized the card wouldn't work, the rigid set of his jaw as he calculated expenses, the quiet shuffle of his feet as he weighed the buffer left behind. These weren't just consequences, they were confirmation of clarity, the tangible results of decisions made. By Wednesday, minor panic had escalated. Messages pinged on my phone. "Elizabeth, this is so weird. My card just declined at that boutique. Can you check?" I responded with calm precision. "No system error. I deactivated your supplementary card last week. Our finances are separate now. Use your debit card for the transition." The dots on his message bubble hovered for a long moment, a silent calculation. He was realizing, piece by piece, the full reality of his choices. At night, I sat in the quiet of my home, reflecting on the process. There was grief, yes, the grief of the life we once shared. But there was also a strange exhilaration, a sense of power in reclaiming agency over my own narrative. For years, I had been the rock, the predictable anchor. Now I was the architect of consequence, the designer of a future free from betrayal. It wasn't fun in the way David wanted. It was deeper, richer, and ultimately more liberating. And as the week closed, a subtle foreshadowing of what was to come lingered in the quiet corners of my home. Patterns he had tried to conceal, late-night texts, strange purchases, whispers of Zara, were now ready to surface. I was patient. I had always been patient. And I had learned the power of waiting while the other side revealed themselves. The storm was approaching, and when it hit, David would see clearly the cost of choosing fun over fidelity, chaos over loyalty. For now, I moved quietly, deliberately, with eyes open and heart steady. This was just the beginning. Saturday morning arrived with an almost cinematic stillness. The sunlight spilled across the living room, catching on the polished surfaces I had once curated for two. And then came the doorbell, a sharp, insistent ring that seemed to reverberate through the carefully constructed calm of my home. I opened the door to find David, flanked by his mother, Margaret, who carried herself with the air of a woman accustomed to having her whims interpreted as moral law. David's casual smile faltered slightly when he saw the calm in my eyes. Margaret, however, marched in as if she owned the space, her presence a challenge in itself. "Elizabeth, I demand you explain this." Margaret's voice was firm, almost theatrical. David lingered behind her, his arms crossed, frustration simmering just below the surface. "You canceled my credit card? Are you trying to humiliate me?" he demanded, though the words felt rehearsed, defensive. "I'm establishing boundaries," I said, my voice steady, almost clinical. "It's standard procedure in a legal separation. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for, independence. This is simply the logical outcome of your choice." David's frustration boiled over. "Standard procedure? This isn't a business merger, Elizabeth. This is my life. You're trying to control me, to punish me for wanting more than this predictable life." I didn't flinch. I let the tension hang in the air for a long beat before delivering the next piece of clarity. "And since we're discussing logistics," I continued, holding his gaze, "you should know that I informed my employer of our separation. As a result, your eligibility for my health, dental, and vision insurance will terminate at the end of the month. You'll receive a COBRA packet explaining how you can continue coverage at your own expense." The color drained from David's face. Margaret looked momentarily confused, grasping for comprehension. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "I can no longer provide coverage for your prescriptions or medical needs," I said calmly. "That includes your migraine medication. The monthly out-of-pocket cost will now exceed $600. David's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to Margaret, silently pleading for support. But the reality was inescapable. The consequences of his choices were crystallizing before him, every step logical, deliberate, and unassailable. "You can't do this to me," David's voice cracked with a mixture of panic and fury. "This isn't the man I married." "Correct," I said simply. "The man you married would have quietly absorbed this betrayal. The woman you left behind is simply running the data, and the data is not in your favor." Margaret gasped. "Elizabeth, this is cruel. You're being cruel." I allowed myself a thin, measured smile. "This isn't cruelty. It's reality. You wanted freedom. You wanted unpredictability. Now you have it, with consequences." David's composure finally snapped. He grabbed Margaret's arm and retreated, leaving a charged silence behind. I watched them go, the tension in the house lingering like smoke after a fire. Even in their departure, I could feel the slow, grinding machinery of the legal process beginning to turn. Letters from lawyers, subpoenas, and formal notices were on the horizon. I had anticipated every move, prepared for every tactic. This wasn't chaos, it was structure, and I was in control. That evening, I sat quietly in my sanctuary, reflecting on the confrontation. There was anger, yes, but also a profound sense of clarity. The storm I had been preparing for was arriving precisely as expected. Every choice David had made, every secret he had tried to conceal, was now exposed to the consequences he had ignored. And in that quiet, I allowed myself a subtle, private satisfaction. Not revenge, not gloating, but the awareness that, for the first time in months, I was no longer the passive party in this unfolding narrative. I was architecting it. Every detail, every calculated step, every tiny consequence, I controlled them all. The war had shifted into a new phase, and I was ready for it. The weeks after the confrontation were a slow, meticulous dance of strategy, observation, and evidence gathering. I hired a private investigator to track David's movements, not out of spite, but necessity. 3 days of surveillance produced a detailed dossier, time-stamped photos of David with Zara, his new mentor and tennis partner, their quiet breakfasts on her balcony, and text messages that left no room for ambiguity. The evidence was methodical, undeniable, and devastating. My lawyer, Victoria, guided each step. We filed for discovery, highlighting the dissipation of marital assets. The money spent on Zara from accounts funded by my salary was carefully documented. Every purchase, every dinner, every trip became part of a quiet legal symphony designed to expose the truth without a single unnecessary flourish. David's world began to unravel. Zara, the carefully constructed guru persona, crumbled under the weight of reality. Her phone call was almost comedic in its terror. "Elizabeth, I think there's a misunderstanding," she stammered. "There is no misunderstanding," I said, my voice calm. ice cold. You've been a material witness in a legal proceeding since you were implicated in the misuse of marital funds. You can cooperate, or you can explain to a judge why you shouldn't. The entitlement, the arrogance, the illusions of control, all of it collided with consequence, and it was beautiful in its inevitability. David and Margaret's calls became a blur of hysteria, threats, and pleading. One moment, Margaret cried about the destruction of the life he had. The next, David raged about betrayal. But I remained outside the storm, composed, steady, untouchable. The rules, the logic, the evidence, they were on my side. The final legal confrontation was anticlimactic in its drama, but seismic in its effect. With the affair exposed and financial misconduct proven, David's leverage vanished. His lawyer, recognizing a lost and expensive battle, pushed for settlement. The results were definitive. The house was sold, equity split fairly. My share provided a secure down payment for a new home, smaller, but mine. Spousal support was minimal, intended only to allow him time to transition to full independence. Dissipation of assets was confirmed. Over $15,000 spent on the affair was deducted from his share. David's carefully constructed fantasy, the life of thrill and fun he sought, had collided with reality. Zara had broken ties, he had lost financial control, and his reputation was fractured. And for me, healing began. Not sudden, not cinematic in a dramatic sense, but deep, quiet, and resolute. Therapy helped me process betrayal, complacency, and the subtle ways I had ignored warning signs. My new home became a sanctuary. Quiet mornings with a complex German coffee maker, weekends hiking in solitude, and small, deliberate pleasures that reminded me life could be predictable and still deeply satisfying. Standing on a ridge overlooking the valley, the wind crisp against my face, I realized something profound. Freedom is not chaos. Freedom is clarity, choice, and the courage to enforce it. I was no longer the anchor for someone else's ship. I was a mountain standing firmly on my own, watching the world below with unshakable calm. The storm had passed. The war was over. And in the quiet aftermath, I discovered something I had almost forgotten: peace, stability, and above all, myself.